Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. The protests in Iran that have dominated the headlines for weeks have resonated strongly in India. The protests began with the death of Mesa Amini, a 22-year-old arrested by the morality police in Tehran for not wearing a hijab properly. It was alleged that she died after being hit on the head. The protests against the death swelled to include demands for more freedom for women. At its core, the protests are about choice. The choice to not wear a hijab or to wear one depending on what your beliefs are. They're about the right to be free to do and be what you wish. And that is why they have found great resonance in India, where many young Muslim women are battling for the choice to continue their education while wearing a hijab. These may seem contradictory battles, but they are not. They're about freedom of choice and state interference in it. It's not the first women led protest India has witnessed. Who can forget the inspiring anti CAA NRC protests and Shaheen Bagh? In the past, I've done an episode on the rise of women led protests in which I interviewed women's rights activist Nausharan Singh, and I'll post the link in the show notes. On this episode, I want to explore the interest Indian women have in the protests in Iran and whether that will inspire them to intensify their own struggle for freedom and rights.
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Kavita Krishnan, well known women's rights activist who has been active on the crisis around violence against women following the 2012 Nirbhaya gang rape. Her speech outside then Delhi Chief Minister Sheila Dikshit's house was widely hailed. In it, she laid out a manifesto of sorts for the movement, which broke away from the protectionist view of women and argued for women's freedom. She made a case for women's unqualified freedom and freedom without fear. And that became a rallying point for anti rape protesters. Subsequently, she wrote the book Fearless Freedom, which questioned why women's freedom is thought to be incompatible with safety. Kavita was also a Politburo member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist Leninist Liberation, and a member of its Central Committee for over 2 decades. However, in September 2022, she stopped holding any posts after differences with the party. Kavita, welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure to be on All Indians Matter.
Kavita, why are women in India watching the Iran protests so closely?
Well, I think more than one reason. One is, of course, the courage that women in Iran are showing in standing up to a very brutal theocracy is inspiring. It's always inspiring to see women protesting at such risk, at such high costs, and showing solidarity for a woman. Mesa Amini, her actual name was Gina, and she wasn't allowed to be, publicly called Gina because of laws in Iran that don't allow women like her of Kurdish origin to have certain names. So Mehsa was her Persian name, her Farsi name, while Gina is actually her name, in her Kurdish community. So for women across Iran of so many diverse backgrounds, including Kurdish, non-Kurdish, everybody, to come out on the streets like this and challenge the patriarchal laws, as well as not only the moral policing but the entire undemocratic kind of dictatorship that is there, the autocracy that is there, for them to come out and say we want democracy and death to the dictator. And their main slogan is zan zindagi azadi, women, life, freedom. And that's beautiful. So, of course, that's one reason. The other reason I think why Iran protests resonate with women in India is that we aren't that far away from a situation like that. So, for instance, a majoritarian politics in India, which wants to turn a secular democratic India into a Hindu nation. So the BJP openly says that, the RSS openly says that, and you have all kinds of, various people aiming to represent Hindu nationalism. They come out and say quite openly that we want a Hindu nation and you're going to have to do as we say. And already, on the route to that, already women's freedoms are restricted by the rise of this kind of Hindu nationalism, Hindu supremacist nationalism, let me put it that way. So, for instance, I write about this in my book. I trace this in my book, how There are groups, vigilante groups, that are linked with the Hindu supremacist politics, that keep track of which Hindu women either fall in love with or try to marry Muslim men. And then they go and abduct these couples and beat up the woman and try to force her to relinquish her relationship with this man. And to the extent that they actually try to make her say forcibly, make her claim that she has been kidnapped or raped or whatever. So they call this kind of relationship love jihad, and they keep trying to, inflict this kind of violence. And it's, of course, it's a violence against Muslim men, but it's also a violence against Hindu women. And this has a long history, actually, because we remember Babu Bajrangi, who was active in the 2002 violence against Muslims in Gujarat, where Narendra Modi was then chief minister of Gujarat. And we've had him boasting about this kind of violence against Hindu women who have relationships outside the community earlier as well, where he said that your daughter is a bomb waiting to explode society. So you have to make sure that the borders of your community, the borders of your caste, are properly policed, because if she crosses the border, if she marries outside her caste, outside her community, outside her faith, then that's like a bomb exploding, and your entire the structure of Hindu caste society will fall. I could go on about this, but I think the basic thing is that this kind of moral policing is, of course, likely to get much stronger if India were to become that kind of a, virtual theocracy, for all purposes, a theocracy. Even if it wasn't called that, you would have that kind of a situation. And we know this because we've been hearing about this from our Pakistani sisters for so long. They've been telling us about what kind of, restrictions in the name of religion and restrictions in the name of Pakistani culture and so on are placed on women in Pakistan. And we know that in India, that can well be a possibility, because your society is already wired for that. Society in India, as I discuss in my book, quite routinely and normally places all kinds of restrictions on women of all communities in India. And of course, the majoritarian kind of moral policing is likely, it already draws on what prevails in Hindu society. Of course, moral policing happens in other minority communities as well, in a big way. But the point is that because Indian politics is right now dominated by a Hindu majoritarian kind of politics, it has that much greater power to turn this kind of behavior into law. And if that were to happen, then, well, there you are. Iran is showing us what could happen here. And that's also why Iranian women struggling, their slogans could be our slogans. Their slogans about asserting, women's right to live their lives freely could be our slogans. And I think their slogans for democracy. Of course, India is formally a democracy, and there's elections, regular elections, and all of that. But I think there are many ways in which our democratic institutions, the very idea of democracy being not a majoritarian rule, but a society where even a minority voice, even someone whose view is not held widely in society, should feel that they can express that view without fear. And which means that a feminist voice in a largely conservative or traditional society should not have to feel afraid. A gay person should not have to feel afraid. Somebody who criticizes the government should not feel afraid, and so on. A journalist should not feel afraid. But unfortunately, we are living in an India where probably fear has never been so dominant as it is now. And that's also why we look at Iran and we think, it's not impossible to imagine a situation of this kind in India one day.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And when you mentioned Pakistan, even Afghanistan came to mind about what is going on there. But Kavita, we'll talk more about that. But the hijab seems to have become a lightning rod of sorts, hasn't it? As you mentioned, in India, a Hindutva government is using it to suppress Muslim women and their education. In Iran, it is being used to restrict the freedoms of their women.
Well, I think that the problem is in India that hijab is seen as, or is projected as something uniquely oppressive to women and also uniquely a Muslim thing. So this is, of course, the Hindu supremacist far right, of course, does this, where they say, oh, Muslim men are peculiarly anti-women, and we are going to rescue Muslim women from Muslim men. And when we say that you can't enter school or college without a hijab, we're actually doing these girls a favor. Anyone who wears a hijab or insists on their right to wear a hijab is radicalized by some kind of terrorist group, jihadi group, this, that. That's of course there. But even beyond that, I would say that there's a tendency in all of us, I think, all over the world, to try and imagine that, various social ills, but especially patriarchy, we are able to recognize it very easily in another community, in another country, in another part of the world. And we find it very hard to recognize it in our own community or country where it masquerades as something normal. So here it looks normal and it looks like your usual culture and so on. And you can't really see it easily. And when someone points it out, you feel very defensive and you say, oh, but that's nothing, right? This goes for any country or community in the world. I've seen this all the time. I get calls from people in the journalists in the US or the UK and who want to talk about, India's rape problem. And I say that, well, actually, it's not a problem that's at all unique to India. Rape culture, the culture that blames women for rape, is extremely common in the countries where you live. It's common in France, it's common in so the experience of violence against women and of all kinds, not only sexual violence but domestic violence, child abuse, a rape culture that basically is very lenient towards these crimes and makes excuses for the men who commit these crimes. All this is, pretty universal. Of course, it presents in different ways and different languages, but you can basically see it anywhere, but it's much easier to see it somewhere else. So that happens to ordinary Hindus in India as well. They're able to see the hijab as something that sticks out like a sore thumb and that, screams patriarchy to them. They can't see, but they see their mother or grandmother covering her head with her pallu as perfectly normal. It's there in all the films. It's there. It's the archetype of the Hindu mother in Hindi cinema. It covers her head, so all over North India, it's so normal, but they don't see that the hijab, which is essentially a headscarf, and the pallu, what is the difference? It's exactly the same thing, but you see that as something, that shocks you, and you see that as some kind of patriarchal domination, and you don't see the pallu like that. You don't see even the parda like that, which is there all over rural North India, especially for young women who are newly married and so on. The parda is expected. And so in front of men you go only with the parda, etc., etc. It's very, very common. Not only that, there are other symbols and signs, of course, which you could argue are normal. My point, I think, is that all these things, their context is important. A hijab could well be. I mean, the pressure to conform, the pressure to obey laws which are imposed by society, of course, these are there on all women. And we all experience that pressure. And whatever we choose to, wear, how we choose to behave, who we choose to marry, how we choose to live our lives, all these are a constant negotiation with this pressure which comes from loved ones, parents, community leaders whom we respect, and government, state, society, you name it, right? The point is, I think, to not imagine that this is uniquely different for Muslim women. To say, oh, but there can't be any notion of choice where the hijab is concerned. The hijab can only and always be oppressive. I think that is, clearly not true, because as we know, any clothes could be any kind of, you could experience a certain kind of, pressure, and you could be just, socialized into, I can say, speaking for myself, that I am a feminist. I completely stand for the right of women to dress exactly as they wish, and I don't see them as any less for, wearing a mini skirt or wearing a bikini or whatever. But if you ask me, if you go to the beach, could you wear a bikini? I'd probably be uneasy and I probably wouldn't. You ask me, "Oh, have you ever worn a miniskirt?" And I'd say, not really, I haven't. I don't feel very comfortable that way. And I'm sure my socialization plays a role in that, right? Of course it is. The society I have lived in spite of all my feminism, that is there somewhere. So I think that, those things are things which are true for all of us. So respecting that in spite of all these pressures, you have to let women decide. You can't tell them that you are being oppressed and so I'm forcing you to take this off, to not wear this or to wear this or to behave like this or to do this or to do that. No, you can't. There are all kinds of religious rules, for instance, in Islam, to not drink. Now, if you go to China and the Uyghur community, apparently, if you are an Uyghur Muslim man and you don't drink, you could be arrested and put in a concentration camp because they say, oh, you're being radicalized. Why aren't you drinking? You have to drink. You can't do that. You just can't do that. What absolute nonsense. And that is oppressive. So the same thing, if you see Iran's context, the slogan that they raise there is, basically it says that we are for freedom and democracy and for the right of choice where the hijab is concerned. Okay. And the right of choice, it's important because, of course, some women may want to wear the hijab for many reasons. But the minute it becomes a rule, a law, which you can be punished for violating, you're bullied for violating it, you're picked up and held for 3 days, 4 days for violating it, and you're slapped around and you're lectured. And, of course, the natural response to that is going to be, I'm not going to wear this thing because you tell me to. How dare you tell me to? It's similar. If, I remember that, this MLA in, I think it was one of the assemblies, I forget which, in India, that taunted by, he was a Muslim man and he was taunted by a Hindu supremacist MP, a BJP MP, to say, you must sing the national anthem to prove that you are Indian. And he said, look, I sing it all the time. But now you are telling me to sing it as a test. I'm not going to do it. I refuse to do that. And I remember that some people like Javed Akhtar and all said, what is this? He should have done it and all of that. And I was like, no, he should certainly not have done it. Because the minute somebody says this is a rule, you have to do it in order to prove your belonging to India or whatever it is, that minute it becomes a tool of oppression. The minute you do it, a lynch mob tells a Muslim on the street, sing Janaganamana or else. That becomes a tool of oppression. That same person could well choose to stand up. He probably does. Always choose to stand up and sing the national anthem with great pride and joy. But the point is, the minute it becomes, so I think context is all. And that's what it's important to remember, that in India, it is as oppressive to forcibly take off the hijab in India or in France as it is to force you to wear the hijab. And this is someone I recommend, I strongly recommend anyone listening to this to please, read the wonderful books of the Iranian born graphic, she calls herself a comic book writer, Marjan Satrapi. So Marjan Satrapi's books about growing up in Iran after the revolution, Islamic revolution, and being forced as a 4-year-old child to start covering up fully in black and having to wear this burqa all the time in public. And then when she becomes a teenager, she's rebelling against it, and her parents send her to France because they're afraid of her growing up in Iran. So she was asked in France, when France introduced the hijab ban, that surely you must be in favor of this because you've written so eloquently about how the hijab being enforced is oppressive. So surely you're happy that France is, is implementing this ban. So one of the comments she made, she had a lot of very good things to say, very sensible things to say. But one of them was, she just looked at them and said, you tell any teenager that they are forbidden from doing something and they're going to do it in rebellion. Are you, really telling me that you're turning the hijab into an act of rebellion right now? And that's exactly what's happening in India. That's exactly what's happening in India. I totally understand and feel empathy for these girls in, Karnataka who are saying, I'm going to wear it to school. Obviously, you're going to do that. If somebody is going to tell you you can't wear that because you're Muslim and you're not supposed to look Muslim, you're going to say, I'm going to look Muslim and with pride and, go to hell, basically. So you're going to do that. And I remember times I've done that as well. As I told you, I don't really wear clothes that are very short or whatever. It's not been my habit. But I remember in my hostel in JNU, a young girl who was a new student came up to me and my roommate and said, I wear this sort of long t-shirt as a nightgown, and then in the same long t-shirt I kind of go off and wait, which is, her bathroom was literally a 2 steps away from her room. So she said, I just go there and wait in line for the bathroom in that same dress with my bucket and all. So two people, including one Hindu fundamentalist and a Christian fundamentalist. Both these girls had come and told this girl that you can't dress like this and it's not done inside a girls' hostel. Okay. So she came to us to say, I wanted to ask you, I don't know you at all, but I just thought for you to look sensible. I wanted to ask you, is this a thing? Do I have to not wear this anymore? What is it? So we told her, you keep wearing what you like. And the next day, we didn't have long t shirts. So we wore short t shirts, the short t-shirts we had, the ordinary t-shirts we have, and stood in that same line and met these two ladies who had, these two moral policers, and they were, staring. They of course knew exactly what was happening, and we behaved as though things were perfectly normal and said, good morning, hi, and all of that. And they knew what we were doing because we were there in solidarity with her. That's exactly what I mean. That you are the very fact that somebody is going to say this is immoral and that is moral, they're going to judge your character. How dare anybody do that? How dare they do that? So I am absolutely opposed to, and I find it very interesting that a lot of the Muslim fundamentalist groups, I mean, there are groups like that, who have been very vocal about, the hijab protests in Karnataka and saying, oh, very good. And, these women are so courageous and all of that. They're extremely silent, they were very, loud about choice and so on here. But they're very silent about what's going on in Iran because they're not for choice, And the same goes for the Hindu fundamentalists who are, pretending to be very happy about what they're saying in Iran and telling us, oh, but you oppose hijab there, you're supporting hijab here. And we said, no, 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 no. We are supporting women's freedom there and women's freedom here. And we don't want the likes of you, we don't want any Hindu Rashtra, we don't want any Islamic Republic. Thank you very much, That's what it is.
Yeah, your JNU story reminded me how similar fundamentalists across religions look, in fact, and behave. And the couple of other things came to mind when you talked about Uyghur Muslims in China, and they're being considered odd if they don't drink. In fact, this part about context is very important. For example, Tibetan Buddhists are not vegetarian, and the Dalai Lama has in fact explained that, because where they come from, in fact, it's very difficult to actually grow anything in terms of vegetables or crops, and that's why they are non-vegetarian. And you don't link Buddhism with non-vegetarianism, but it's all about context. And lastly, I think when it comes to the Hindu fundamentalist groups who are trying to get women to remove their hijabs before they can get into college, it's difficult to believe that any of them actually do care about the welfare of Muslim women as they claim to be doing. They absolutely don't. It's about oppressing them, isn't it?
No, of course. They're releasing the rape convicts, who were early released.
Yeah, that was shocking. This whole Bilkis Banu convicts being released on for good behavior, and then lawmakers going up and saying these are sanskari
Yeah, yeah.
people.
And the central
Yeah,
government
yeah. And these are the
itself.
guys going around saying that, we care about Muslim women. Obviously, they don't.
Yeah, yeah. So that's obviously absolutely not true, because you're caring about someone means that you care about their dignity. You don't want to say, I am superior to you, your menfolk are all subhuman and I'm here to rescue you. Muslim women know that you are not there to do that, that you have great contempt for them. In fact, Muslim women, you selectively you do this thing about auctioning them online and all of that. These are supporters of the ruling party in India, Hindu supremacist party in India. So I think the both kinds of behavior towards Muslim women by Hindu supremacists, whether it is the so-called benign, I'm here to rescue you mode, or whether it is the mode in which they are calling them sulli and bully and all kinds of other horrible, horrible words, they're both the same posture, basically. So I think that they don't know how to. But there is something else vis-a-vis Iran which I just want to point out. I think that obviously our solidarity with women in Iran, with women in Afghanistan, of course, absolutely, we must have a solidarity with them. But I also want to point out that there are, many struggles going on, and look at the connections between them. So, Iran is fighting for democracy right now, and the Iranian regime is killing protesters. It is incarcerating protesters in prisons, torturing them there. And, there was a huge fire in one of those prisons. We don't know who has survived and who has not. That is a prison where some of Iran's top filmmakers and writers are held because of their dissent. And they're continuing to struggle, and we wish them success. But remember that the Iranian regime is also supplying, arms, drones, and so on to Russia right now in order to kill Ukrainians. And so I just want to, tell everyone that we should be supporting. We should realize that these oppressors help each other, and so the oppressed should help each other. And especially, I have a word to those who feel very defensive. If, as a Hindu, you think you have to identify with the RSS and not with a Hindu woman who just wants to live her life as she wants to. Why is that? You should be asking yourself that question. Likewise, if you're a Muslim anywhere in the world, and you suddenly feel that you have support for those, in the Islamic Republic who are imposing a hijab, or for the Saudi regime that imposes all kinds of patriarchal laws, and you don't have any sympathy for the Muslim women who are fighting against this, or for the dissenters, or for the gay Muslim men and who are fighting against this kind of a regime, then you should ask yourself, does humanity, what's the relationship between, the weight you give to human dignity and equality, and the weight you give to your interpretation of a religion? You're allowed to live your life as you think your religion tells you to. But if you say that everyone who is part of this religion has to live it this way, and that they have no choice but to live it that way, and especially women, gay people, you basically think that, you keep referring to women as naked if they are not dressed the way you want them to be dressed. You think a woman in a swimsuit is naked. You don't have a right to say that about her. You just don't. Hindu supremacists do that, so do Muslim fundamentalists. You have no right to say that. Whatever clothes she's wearing, those are the clothes she's chosen to wear. She's clothed. And when you refer to her as naked and so on, basically that describes some problem in your mind, in your thinking. And that is what needs to be addressed and corrected.
Absolutely. Also, Kavita, I wanted to point out that all these protests that we are seeing across the world, and now we've seen them in Turkey, we've seen them in Hong Kong, we've seen them in Brazil, Spain, of course, India, Iran. I'm referring to women led protests here. All of them started with one issue. It could have been abortion, it could have been the hijab, or whatever. They've then become bigger than that. Today, the protests in Iran are not just about hijab, it's also about equal rights for women
It's
and so on.
democracy. Democracy. They're
It's
openly saying we
democracy.
want
Exactly right.
democracy. Yeah.
Exactly right. The question I had is that even when the Shaheen Bagh protests happened, and then there were a succession of women-led protests against the CA and RC in India, it almost seemed as if the women were realizing the power that they had only then. I mean, they hadn't realized how much power they held in themselves. Explain this to us. I mean, how does a movement that starts at one thing then becomes something bigger to include many other things, and why are such movements important? I'm referring specifically to the women-led movements.
I just wanted to say this, that basically you have had, for instance, if you look at the anti dowry protests in Delhi in the 1980s, I think it was, you see that two of the, leading, sort of leaders of that who emerged as leaders, they were ordinary women whose daughters were killed for dowry. And they led the protests, and two of them were Satyarani Chadha and Shah Jahan Appa. So, Muslim woman, a Hindu woman, perfectly ordinary, no political background, but they emerged and became feminist activists, and which they remained all their lives. You've had these tremendous protests many times. I think that what happens is that when there is a crackdown on democracy, then women are often very central to how these, very authoritarian and fascist ideologies, when they present themselves, control over women, deciding who is a good woman and who's a bad woman. This is extremely central. It was there in Nazi Germany. It was there in American racism in the 20s, 30s, all of that, the Jim Crow era. It's always been there in Indian caste society. It's certainly a part of Hindu supremacist politics and all of that. It's there in the Manusmriti. It's very much a part of, you look at the ways in which any religious fundamentalist group, even if it's a very small one with no power, they will exercise power over the women inside their community. They may have no power in public. They may have no power in the country. They may be oppressed. For instance, a Muslim organization in India, of course, it is suffers from all kinds of oppression at the hands of Hindu supremacist government. And I'm not comparing the two. I'm not saying the violence by the state is way, way worse. But I'm just saying that, you say you want democracy, equal rights, this, that, but you deny the same thing to the women in your community. And I'm saying that to you. Of course, Hindus do the same to women in their communities. But to you, if you are actually fighting for democracy and equal rights, then how can you not see that everyone deserves it? So the ability to kind of broaden your horizon and allow your sense of justice to become more capacious and to embrace the rights of everyone, to actually behave, understand the rights and dignity of other minorities, such as gay people in your community and so on. This is what one would expect, right? And sometimes when a movement is really at its height, that is what happens. And I think that's what we're seeing in the US, for instance, in this realization in the US right now. I just told you about how Indian women are looking at Iranian women and thinking, well, one day we may be in that situation. So are American women. American women, had you asked them even a decade or 2 decades ago, they would have not believed that Roe versus Wade could be overturned by the Supreme Court, that the
It
Supreme
was
Court would
unimaginable. Yeah.
yeah, they really couldn't. They knew it was a vague possibility, but they didn't really believe that the Supreme Court would actually go to the extent of of rolling back a freedom that has been hard won. You see, that makes it, when you've never had that freedom and you're fighting for it, it's one thing. But when you've had it, your life has been organized around the idea that I do not have to carry an unwanted pregnancy. I have that right over my body, and suddenly I don't anymore. So if you are, especially if you're a woman with poor means, you're not earning well, this entire economy is in shambles right now in the US, and you're thinking about this thing that could happen to you, and then it would just upturn your life, and the court is not with you. The same thing in India also. I think the trust for a court's ability to understand. I would recommend that everyone read, the verdict by who's the other judge? Not Hemant Gupta, the other judge on the hijab judgment just now. There's a split verdict, right? So the other judge, Dhulia, I think his name is Justice Dhulia. I would recommend. It's very simply written. It's not written in legalese, and so you'll find it online. And if you're listening to this, absolutely read it, because it's a beautiful judgment where it's not just about women. As I said, it addresses even the notion of discipline. And it tries to say what matters more to us. What is education? Education is not just about a bunch of disciplined children sitting in military style uniform. It is about children learning about and having. And he imagines the life of a young girl and says, would you rather she come to school, or would you rather she had to stay away from school because you won't let her in with whatever dress is normal in her community, her family, her whatever? It's up to her when she grows up, when she's an adult, when she has her life to choose for herself. She may change her mind, but that is her mind, right? And when you're dealing with teenagers, as I said, you have to be all that much more sensitive to this. And they are reacting to a terrible sense of injustice in the world around them, to Islamophobia, and they're wanting a way to affirm that they're Muslims in public. You have to respect that, right? If the world changes, their view of how they perceive their assertion, their feminism, their dignity may change. And I think that we should be opposing anyone imposing something on someone else. That is really a simple thing. And for the state to be telling people what to wear, what not to wear, sorry, that is a total violation of privacy, and it shouldn't happen. But as I said, I think the broader sense of democracy, where America, Iran, India, everybody is understanding that there is something bigger at stake here. They're able to do this because of the general climate of rising fascism and authoritarianism. White supremacy in America, and in India, Hindu supremacists. In Russia, these terrible laws. And, in his public speeches, Putin goes on calling gay and lesbian people Satanists. He keeps saying that the family only has to be like mama, papa, and bache. You can't have, what is this? You can't have two moms, two pops. You can't do that. And he's, going on about anti-feminist rubbish. He's saying, all kinds of things. And he's describing all that as Satanism, and he's saying that all these ideas are all Western ideas, they're Western liberal ideas, and they're not Russian ideas, and all of that. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Because that's exactly what we as feminists have heard in India so much, especially from those who claim to be the custodians of, Indian culture, Hindu culture, Muslim culture, whatever. We've heard that all the time. That this is our culture, and you don't understand it, and you feminists are all Westernized, and this and that. So I think that there's a sense in which people understand, that this needs to be challenged, and women's rights, nari mukti, sabki mukti. So, freedom for women, freedom for everyone.
And before I proceed, Kavita, the justice's name that you were looking for is Justice Sudhanshu Dhulia. And the quote that he said was, ultimately, it's a matter of choice, nothing more, nothing less. And if memory serves, he cited Articles 14 and 19 of the Constitution when he gave a dissenting judgment against his fellow judge. So, Kavita, I had a couple of questions here. When it comes to women-led movements, what does it say about the politics of our time? For instance, do you detect a power shift happening? So that's the first part of my question. The second part of my question is, how does a women-led movement differ from the other kind of movement, which would be a more general-led or a male-led movement?
Look, I don't see leadership in movements as being related with having power. I see it as basically challenging power. So, any movement, a people's movement basically challenges power. And it is against arbitrary power of the state, of, whatever, of any kind of power which is seen as illegitimate and an imposition by people, right? Now, the problem is that movements don't set out to be led by people of a particular gender. They don't happen that way. The only situation is that, in general, when you have a movement, like everything else in, the societies we live in, what tends to happen is that the men who are in leadership, they get to be heard more, their decisions are more likely to be respected, they are likely to just get more of a say about what is to be done next, and so on. And people have written entire histories about of very remarkable movements in which there were very remarkable women. So people have written, for instance, about the American civil rights movement, and we know Martin Luther King. But if somebody asks you the names of the women who stood by him when he marched in Selma, or any of the other like iconic moments, people will scratch their heads and maybe come up with one Rosa Parks or something like that. Even Rosa Parks, they don't recognize as a campaigner, as a leader in her own right of the civil liberties movement. They think of her, the story about her is an old woman who was tired on a bus. No, she chose to go, and she was exactly like these women taking off their hijabs. She insisted on being on that bus and refusing to get up from her seat, which was supposed to be a seat reserved for white people. She did it as a deliberate act of civil disobedience to a racist law. She did it as part of a planning of the civil liberties movement, but very often we don't know that. Likewise, in many movements, I think that's the case. In India, probably more so, because I saw, for instance, quite close up during the farmers' movement that, of course, there was so many women from farming communities who participated, and they were very enthusiastic, and they did a fantastic job, absolutely. But in leadership, I think that the farm movements almost exclusively had the farm organizations almost exclusively were led by men, and they did not really see any problem with that. They didn't. And so when it was about talking to the media, whatever it is, if you look at the actual farm organizations, I don't mean leaders like Kavita Kuruganti or Amidha Patkar and all of that, who came from other movements. I'm talking specifically about farm organizations from Punjab or UP or wherever they came from. There were not any women leaders, who could come and represent. And I think that very, very few, I think. So I think that that is where, we need to sort of question ourselves a little. So I'm not saying that leadership by women has something specially wonderful to it and makes a huge difference or whatever. I think that the whole point is that we need diversity in our movements. We need diversity in all kinds of leadership. And any movement that, or any, even a panel discussion where you barely have one woman, I'm sorry, that should really trouble us. If you can't find speakers who are women, who are, LGBTQ, who are Dalit, who are Muslim, who are, from so many diverse backgrounds, linguistically and otherwise, we should be asking ourselves questions about that, right? That is not right. So when it comes to women-led movements, movements initiated by women, which have then become, way bigger and all of that, I think that, it's what I said earlier, that I don't see those movements as necessarily being more democratic, more inclusive than others or whatever. Not so much that, but I just think that the very fact that that dam broke at the point of patriarchy, there is something very important and very significant about that. And, it's a reminder to us that in every movement, that dam should break, that dam needs to break in every
Yeah.
movement.
Kavita, social media and other digital communication tools have made it easier for people to collaborate across geographies. Do you think that women across countries will start reaching out to each other for support, encouragement, ideas, and even to collaborate in their movements?
I think that that's already happening. So I remember that there have been women's strikes across countries, where there was a lot of collaboration, and it was an international kind of effort on International Women's Day some years ago, I think. And there have been other instances of collaborating and talking to each other, having conversations with each other across geographies, and absolutely that's happened very often, and I'm sure it'll keep happening. That I see our time as a peculiarly divided and divisive time, where even those on the progressive side, I think, there is a tendency to have some kind of look at the world through a certain kind of lens, framework, a filter. And through that filter, we decide which movements we are going to support and which we are not. Okay. And I don't really like that. One of the reasons, you described my parting of ways with the party to which I had belonged for 3 decades. And one of the reasons was something allied with this. So let me give you an instance. You talking about the Iran protests. I went to websites which are popular in India, which give you sort of left wing news about, movements across the world. Several of them, in fact. So one of them is People's Dispatch. Okay, there wasn't a word about the Iran protests. None. Okay. Not, it's like they haven't happened. If you go to that website, it's as though it just, nothing has happened in Iran, nothing is happening in Iran. Why? Because that is run by a certain kind of politics, which calls itself left wing politics, but which is supportive only of movements that are against regimes which are either American or allied with America. So they don't like any protests that are happening against any regime, however fascist, however authoritarian, however cruel, however dictatorial, which they see as anti American, which they see as challenging US hegemony. So they won't support Ukraine. They won't even mention Iran protests. They will not support, the Uyghur Muslims cause in China. The only thing they'll say about that is that all this is Western propaganda and all of that. So I think that puts our ideas of, and that affects the women's movement as well, believe me. It does, because I think, I remember that when the Ukraine war was happening, then there was a feminist statement initiated, which had come to, women of all countries, feminists of all countries to sign. And I had refused to sign that because, in the name of anti-war, they had a sort of message which didn't seem to distinguish between Ukraine's right to resist an invasion and Russia's invasion. So you can't say both are, there and we want peace and everyone has to be peaceful. If Ukraine is peaceful and doesn't fight back, then Ukraine is dead. Ukraine is finished. So it has a right to fight back, right? So recognizing its right to resist. So then there was another feminist statement that was initiated by Ukrainian feminists. And I got a lot of women in India to sign that, a lot of men as also to sign that, because that basically called itself a right to resist manifesto. So of course it raised all kinds of feminist issues, even about patriarchy in Ukrainian society, and issues they had with their government and all of that. But the point is that they put it in the context of, we first have to resist and survive as a country. And Ukrainian women are being raped by Russian soldiers and all of that. And we have a right to fight back. This is a feminist issue. So I'm looking for that kind of conversation and collaboration, which is, open and frank, where we are free to criticize each other, point out each other's blind spots, and really have a collaboration which is respectful of these, or any movement against patriarchy and authoritarianism, any of those movements.
Absolutely. Before, Kavita, I go on to talk about some of the concepts that you've raised, like unqualified freedom. Which is the movement that inspires you the most?
If I were to choose certain moments in history, certain stories in history, then some of the movements that have inspired me most come from the civil liberties struggle in America, as well as the movement against anti-Vietnam War struggle as well. So I remember that these three sportsmen, two black sportsmen and one Australian white sportsman in the Olympics who had won medals, there the black men raising their fists in the black
The Black Power
salute, the
salute.
power salute, and the Australian guy also standing in solidarity with them, wearing a badge against racism. They all suffered for it. Their careers suffered for it. But wow, what a moment. So I find it inspiring when people stand up to something their own country is doing, but is doing wrong. That takes courage. That means you have to stand out from the crowd. That means you may be seen as, or called, anti, because you're anti-government, they may call you anti-country, anti-national. But that courage is what inspires me. And likewise, there's a little known story, much less well-known story, in which women played a big part. That was the burgling of an FBI office in Pennsylvania during the Vietnam War, where this bunch of ordinary civilians, and by the way, they were not leftists, they were Catholic anti-war activists, and they decided that they had to burgle the FBI and find evidence of the FBI's surveillance of citizens. And much of the surveillance happened, it was surveillance against all activists, but especially against black students and black activists on campuses and all. And they actually brought it out, and they were close friends, but they decided that after this we must part ways, not have these friendships, so that we are more difficult to discover. And then they sent it to the media, and most of the media rejected it and gave the letters and all to the FBI. The Washington Post did publish, and then 20 years later, and these people had all gone their separate ways, and had made this pact never to communicate with each other. But one husband and wife couple, so this journalist who actually published, she came back to that husband, and she had no idea that they were part of this leak. So she just visited them because she was in the area, and well, it was 20 years later. Statute of limitations is gone. So their young daughter, who was in her maybe late teens, came into the room, and they introduced her to this woman, saying, "This is, Betty Metzger, and she is the one who published, the documents that we burgled from the FBI." And the daughter didn't seem to realize, what a huge bombshell this was. And she goes off. And then this woman says, "That was you?" So this is an ordinary couple. These are all ordinary citizens who showed extraordinary courage and extraordinary. So it just shows you that individuals can make a difference. You don't have to be really powerful, or, you don't have to be a so-called celebrity or a well-known person in order to make a difference. In fact, you may keep your light under the radar, like these people did. Nobody knew their names. For 20 years, they managed to keep silent. They didn't say, "We did this great thing and we managed to evade the FBI." The FBI came to our house, but they didn't know. They couldn't realize it's us who've done it. They didn't say that. They just kept quiet. And I think in this day and age of social media, where we feel the minute we've done something, we have to publicize it online, or else it hasn't happened, I think that story really inspires me.
Yeah, when you mentioned that some of these movements were against their own government, it reminds me of that quote that a patriot must be ready to defend his country even against his own government. I think it was by American author Edward Abbey, but don't hold me to it. I could be wrong on that. Kavita, I want to talk about the concept of unqualified freedom that you have spoken about in the past. Explain that to us, and how do these caveats to freedom that women are granted actually affect them in their day to day lives?
Well, I think that, in general, the idea of freedom alongside women faces a lot of outright mockery and insults. And the ways in which this is done in the name of so called common sense. So I'll share a couple of ways in which this is done. One is, of course, there are people who say pretty openly they associate freedom for women with sexual promiscuity, with nakedness, and this and that. And I remember a pretty well known Hindi columnist, is no more. I won't name him, but I did write something, I think, in Kafila in response to what he said, where, in the wake of this movement where Azadi had become a slogan in the context of the anti rape agitation, he wrote this thing about, all this talk of freedom, this is basically sexual promiscuity. And he said something about utshrinkal is the word he used. So utshrinkal literally means free from shackles. And but in Hindi, the implication is a sort of sexual licentiousness. So you're enjoying a license sexually which you shouldn't be doing. So there is a taint of immorality associated with utshrinkalta, and that's what he associated azadi with for women. And the point is that I had to respond by saying, why is utshrinkalta a bad thing? Why should there be any shrinkla for women? Why should there be, Mahadevi Varma wrote shrinkla ki kadiyan and talked about breaking those shackles, and here you are in the 21st century coming out and telling us that this is not done and we can't have freedom and whatnot. And you are mocking the idea of freedom for women by sexualizing it. The point is, even sexual freedom, what's wrong with it? And this is very common, by the way. If you remember what Vibhuti Narayan Rai, another like very well-known Hindi writer, and he was a vice chancellor at that time of a university, he said this about women writers in Hindi, saying that, he was commenting on the fact that they tend to write about their own lives, and their own lives meaning also their love lives. And he said something about, he called them all chinal. So chinal is a word which means prostitute. And so the idea is, and now the men have always written about their sex lives, okay? All the great writers, oh my, look at, centuries of writing, and men have continuously written about it. But nobody calls them prostitutes for so doing. But, if women write, then, it's not done. So I think that this idea is very, very common. But there's another way in which the idea of freedom for women is mocked. And that is in this common sense way of saying, here you are giving speeches about women should have the right to go out at night. But, it's common sense that you should be worrying about safety. And of course, if you have any good sense, then you wouldn't go out. It's
In
so
fact,
simple.
didn't Sheila Dikshit, when she was chief minister, say that about a
Said
journalist
that.
who was,
Yeah, no, she did. I mean, to her credit, right now, since we have so far worse leaders, I have to say that to her credit, she later said that she made a mistake by saying that and she shouldn't have
yeah,
said
yeah.
that.
For
So
the
I know it
listeners,
came
I
out of
just
her
say
mouth.
that yeah,
Yeah.
there was a journalist who was had a very sort of scary experience while she was out on Delhi's roads in the night.
No,
She
she was
was killed,
killed.
yeah,
She was
and
killed. She was
absolutely,
killed. Soumya
that's right.
Vishwanathan, she was killed, and she was out in the night. And this one, Sheila Dikshit had, when she was told about this, the first thing that came out of her mouth was, "Oh my God, she was, so reckless. Why was she out at night or something like that?" But later, she
Yeah, that
did
was a,
say that.
astounding statement.
Yeah, she later said that, I did say that, but I was wrong to say it, which is a lot better than people who apologize by saying, if it has hurt you, then I apologize, but I didn't mean it. So at least, she didn't say that. She said, yes, I am a woman and I do know, I have, like, I know young women and I know that I shouldn't have said this. This was the wrong thing to say. So this thing about really common. Now, the point is that those men who are giving you this so called common sense advice, they are not even for a second putting themselves in the shoes of women. Women live their entire lives, and anywhere in the country, by the way, in the world, by the way, not just in India, but certainly in India also, you're living your lives continuously gauging risk and figuring out what you can do safely. We are continuously strategizing for safety. So for to have men tell us that you should be careful and you are trying to be reckless by saying you'll go out at night and all, we are saying it in defiance, sure, because we don't want a woman who faces violence to be continuously blamed for that violence, no matter when it happens, day or night. Whether it happens by a known person or a stranger, people find a way to blame her, and we don't want to do that, and that is why we challenge this. But the point is, in our lived lives, we continue. There are studies that have shown that women spend more on transport, or they miss out on studying in a better college in Delhi because they want to live closer to a college for safety's sake, and so they settle for a college which is closer to their home or whatever it is, where they have to travel less. And they're spending more on travel when they do, because they may take a cab where others may just take a bus, or and the bus may involve walking. So women are continuously strategizing for safety. Okay. And so, for men to keep implying that somehow safety is a common sense thing, and if only you just obeyed common sense, you would be safe, that is an outrageous assumption. And you asked about how these notions of safety affect women. Every time there is a very publicized incident of violence and all of that against women, and the media is dwelling on these graphic details, invariably I have especially young women calling me to say, because of this, my parents don't want me to go to college and study outside my hometown. They are want, or if they're studying in a city, their parents want to call them back. There are so many women who are afraid of reporting sexual violence because they are not afraid of the intimidation they're going to face or whatever. They're afraid, above all, of what will happen to their education if their parents hear about it. They fear that their parents are going to end their education. So this whole idea of that you can this that the more you restrict a woman's mobility and freedom, the safer she is, it's not even true, because all over the world it's well recognized that women are least safe inside their own homes. There's violence happens to women in their closest relationships, in their homes, and so on. And yet we keep this myth alive that somehow by restricting, so I think that's a really dangerous idea. And the restrictions that exist already in our society, in India particularly, I've written about that in my book, that they're a form of violence. They're not protecting you from violence. They themselves are a form of violence. You are being restricted from access to the outside world unless it is mediated through permission by some patriarchal authority inside your home. And that's happening in ordinary homes, which are, loving homes, ordinary homes, and it is accepted as perfectly natural and normal. And I think that that violence, that is a form of violence. And there's a poem, I think, by Alok Dhanwa, where Bhagi Hui Ladkiyan, where he says something about how the shackles of the home become visible when a woman runs. Till then it's not visible. It's like what Rosa says, you don't know you are. It's only when you shake your chains that you know that you are, you are so I think that that you are unfree. And so that happens especially when a beloved daughter, when she wants to marry outside the caste or community, that is when that violence, which is still then you know seeming very benign and protective, that violence becomes so clear. And unfortunately, in our law books there is no name for that violence. And so that, in order to find evidence of that violence, you have to look at rape allegations. So a good some 40% of rape cases in India that reach courts have been shown to be false cases, not false cases where women are reporting. They're false because women have not reported them at all. Women or girls have not reported them. The women or girls' parents have reported consensual elopement as rape and kidnapping. And that behind that false allegation by the parents lies a story of terrible violence against that girl or the woman.
In fact, I just, while you were speaking, I looked up Alok Dhanwa's poem, Bhagi Hui Ladki, and I just want to read out the first couple of lines. I will put the link in the show notes. He says that, घर की जंजीरें कितनी ज्यादा दिखाई पड़ती है जब घर से कोई लड़की भागती है. So I think that's quite telling. So, what made you think of writing Fearless Freedom?
To me, I had been sort of thinking about this for quite some years, even before 2012. So, before 2012, a website called Sanhati had asked me to write something about sexual violence in India. And in that, for the first time, I had tried to write about how I was uneasy with rape protests that were often organized only against stranger rape, and where the only slogans would be assuming that the whole of society is against rape. So I felt as though, that assumption that everyone is on the same page and everybody, that everyone abhors rape, and that only some men who are of a particularly criminal bent, they do rape. So I felt that those slogans don't really reflect, they aren't doing their job, in the sense that they are not touching that fault line where, in fact, a large part of society has a lot of excuses for rape. So they see, stranger rape is one thing, but very often when rape, the far more common rape is by a known person. Then, the idea of believing women, the idea of, instead of believing them, women are blamed and often held responsible. So that, and the idea of what is rape, I wrote in that piece also about the fact that what is rape is often very cloudy in people's minds. And I wrote about, I didn't know the statistics then, but I wrote from my own experience of people I'd seen around me, about how a woman marrying someone whom she loves but her community disapproves of is often, referred to as rape in police cases as well as otherwise. So the difference between seeing rape as men's access to a forbidden woman, and the forbidding could be, patriarchal or caste based or communal or whatever. But the idea that there are some women you're allowed to do what you like with, and those are women, your wife, for instance. There, the concept of consent doesn't exist. But when you do it to someone who is my community's woman and you are from a different community, you have no right to do that. That's rape. So the difference between that, the idea of rape as a violation of consent is absolutely missing. So I had been writing and thinking about that. And of course, I kept thinking that, to me, the things which bothered me most as I was growing up and later as an activist were the everyday denial of our freedoms. This various kinds of restrictions which pass as absolutely common sense, wardens, parents, so many people telling you, very putting restrictions on you and expecting you to stand by them, including restrictions on what you wear and so on, basically, which are all forms of blaming you for violence when it does happen, if it does happen. So I had that in mind in 2012, of course, the fact that it was in so many women's minds and so many women raised slogans against it. And, you know, my speech, which you mentioned, that resonated with so many women precisely because they were not hearing it elsewhere. They were not hearing their own anxieties and their own concerns about freedom reflected anywhere. And so then later, I basically thought that I wanted to write about this and look at the various contexts in which this kind of normalization of unfreedom for women comes in handy for so many people, not for right wing politics, for corporations which want a very docile labor force, for colleges and universities which try to discipline girls and women. And so it's not just happening out of cultural reasons, it is, there are also very material reasons. So very modern forces are, they are happy to reinforce these things. So it is not about tradition, culture, backwardness, this, that. So when you unpack it, it looks very different. And also, of course, in the contexts of, marginalized communities like the Adivasis in Bastar or the Kashmiri women in conflict areas, basically. The idea that, your exercise of your freedom could have such terrible consequences in those places, far worse than anywhere else. And not only for, young girls, but even for young boys, where you could be killed simply because, you were out in the forest or you were out on your cycle meeting a boyfriend or whatever it is. So I just wanted to write about those things and sort of put them together in one place and try to show how even behind the so-called benign campaigns, which are, about toilets or something like that, Swachh Bharat or whatever, that there also there are so many, these restrictions are taken for granted. So the idea is that if you that famous ad, right, where Vidya Balan is telling a potential mother-in-law who's asking her daughter-in-law to properly, your parda khisak gaya hai, so keep your parda properly because your parda, again in the context of what we started talking about, the veil and hijab and all of that. Just think of
Yeah.
that. This is on TV everywhere and no one objects to it, right? So this was part of a government sponsored campaign. Okay. So she says that, and then this girl basically wants to go to the loo. So the mother-in-law says, go outside. Everyone goes outside. There's no toilet. So then Vidya Balan says, tab to parda hata hi do, remove the parda. What's the point of the parda? And the mother-in-law says, why, shocked and all of that. And she says, because if she's going to go outside and, do her business in outside in the public, basically out in the open, then she might as well not wear a parda. So what, I'm finding it hard to unpack all that's wrong in that ad. Okay. But basically, you get my point that the idea of, women being restricted, women being in parda, women not being allowed out of the house, all is taken for granted. No challenge to any of that. And toilets are being justified in the name of keeping women inside the house. And, in actual conversations with women, I have had women tell me that in dismay that we don't want to use the toilets in the house. We want, because the time we go outside for the loo is the only time we have where friends can go together, chat to each other without surveillance, without family members listening and all of that. So they really enjoy that. They feel it's their morning walk and they have a right to do that. So, that appeal doesn't even work for women. You are assuming various things about women wanting to be locked up inside the home 24/7 and therefore wanting a toilet indoors, which is simply not true. So your messaging about the toilet should be about hygiene, not about women's safety, to which it's not even remotely connected.
And what's been the reaction to the book?
I'll tell you one lovely reaction. There have been others, but it was released right when the lockdown began, so it had no publicity whatsoever because there was no all the plans for publicity were all junked basically because it was a lockdown. But I'll tell you that during the farmers' movement, I was at Singhu border on before 26th January when this big rally was to happen. So on 25th night, I had stayed over at Singhu border. And so early morning, I was in the line for a loo or whatever to wash up. And, several people were in the line and I was kind of drowsy and, groggy. And suddenly one of the girls in the line, and she was someone who'd come from Chandigarh with her friends. And they had all come together. And this was the first time they were traveling alone. And they had come just to join the farmers' protest. So this girl looked at me and said, she then began whispering to her friend, and they both took a good look at my face and then said, are you Kavita Krishnan? And I said, yes. And they said, you wrote Fearless Freedom and we loved the book. And then she called all her friends and said they'd all read it and they were so thrilled. And, it was the most brilliant thing. And then they all sort of helped me to go right to the front of the queue saying, no, 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 this is the least we can do. You break the queue right here. And it was lovely because, that was the kind of affirmation I felt that the book had resonated with these young women whom I did not know. And, the kind of women who would want to come out, and join a protest and come alone, as a group of girls, all the way from Chandigarh to Delhi. It was lovely. Yeah. So that kind of reaction I totally live for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was. Yeah. I'll just tell listeners that I'll put the link to your book in the show notes. But Kavita, here's a question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
Well, I've had to ask myself that question recently because I'm sort of reviewing everything, because of the political sort of change I made and all of that. So I think that, different people, we may have different ways of doing it. Different people, have choose different paths in life. But I think that, if we are looking at society as it is, full of inequalities and full of injustices, and if we feel that those inequalities and injustices are not just, sort of natural, and that if we feel that we should challenge them and we should support others who are challenging them, then I think, whatever way you choose to do it, you may not choose to do it as someone who does activism 24/7. You may do it while being part of a job, while, so I would just tell listeners that For me, the thing I'd like to say is that don't think it's only people like me who are doing something. So don't outsource this job of changing the world just to people who sort of do it, 24/7. We all have to do that. And, every person can make a difference. Every person can be part of collectives who make a difference. And so, speaking up against injustice, speaking up against the rampant communalism that we see all around, I see that as being the most urgent thing right now. We keep hearing bigoted anti-Muslim hate speech everywhere. I have, in the last years, I mean, it has just become ubiquitous. Everywhere you hear it. And I make it a point to try and, remind myself of the young girl I was as I was growing up, where if I ever heard anything like this, I would immediately butt in and, tell people why that was wrong. And I try to be that person even now. And I know my mother's like that. She's 72 now. And she also tries to do exactly this. And I worry about her sometimes because, she used to live alone till recently. And she would just, if she heard anything like this, she'd just butt in and say, how dare you say that? That's wrong. What on earth? And it may seem futile, and you may tell yourself, in the interests of self-preservation, why should I do this? But I feel as though just ordinary people doing this, refusing to let a hateful WhatsApp forward go any further than yourself, push back immediately and say, what is the source of this? I'm sure this is wrong, and whatever it is, you can't be forwarding this. Just doing those things, I think, will make a difference. And everyone is a fighter against injustice, or can be.
Kavita, I think this is an important moment for women in India, and not just Muslim women. Thank you for coming on the show and talking about it.
It's my pleasure, absolutely. And I'm so happy to have spoken to you about it.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.